that's where he's been, you're not going to be able to bring the two sides together. The other problem as far as...
And we're going to break away from this recorded program, take you live now back to the U.S. Senate, just back in from a party caucus recess. The business at hand, we understand the nomination of Samantha Power to be U.S. Ambassador to the UN. Live coverage of the Senate always here on C-SPAN 2.
There will be 2 hours for debate, equally divided between the proponents and opponents.
Mr. President.
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, tell my friend Floyd I'll be very brief, and I ask consent that my statement follow that of the chairman and ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee. But I wanted to say that I strongly support the nomination of Samantha Power to be the next U.S. ambassador to the UN. I've told the President I'm very pleased with his choice. She's born of Irish parents and raised in Ireland. That's not the only reason I support her. I think of her schooling at Yale and Harvard, her Pulitzer Prize winning book, Problem from Hell, or leadership of the Carter Center for Human Rights, all of these things. She's a person of exceptional integrity, extraordinary intellect, strong moral compass, an internationalist. I know at the National Security Council she brought much-needed attention to human trafficking, protection, refugees, gay rights, gender-based violence. But people may be less aware of the devotion she has to the principles on which this country was founded. She's an American patriot. She not only strive to ensure the U.S. leads by example to the United Nations, but do it in a way that honors our Constitution. I know others will speak for her, some against her. But to those senators of either party who have at times differed with this administration over foreign policy, or who may doubt the importance of U.S. support for the United Nations, you should talk with her. You'll find no one better informed, no one more willing to listen to other points of view, and ultimately no one more persuasive than Samantha Power. And I ask consent my full statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak for 4 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, fellow senators, I rise today to introduce a bill called the Idaho Wilderness Water Facilities Act. This is a bill that is identical to the House version, H.R. 876, which was introduced and carried through the House by my colleague from Idaho, Representative Mike Simpson, who did yeoman's work on pursuing this, on putting it together and shepherding it through. It passed unanimously in the House. I want to thank him on behalf of all Idahoans for his work on this issue. The need for this legislation is simple. The Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness Area, which was designated by Congress in 1980, abuts the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness Area, which was designated by Congress in 1964. These areas contain some of the largest and most rugged, remote tracts of land in the lower 48 states. It's magnificent. It is in beauty substantially better, in my opinion, than the Alps. There are a number of water diversions within the Idaho wilderness areas that have existed since the time of this legislation, since the time that these wilderness areas were established. Although the diversions continue to exist, the owners currently lack authority to maintain and repair the facilities. Predating the existence of these two wilderness areas, private landowners had received permits to maintain and repair water diversions that existed on National Forest System lands. The water is used for a combination of many things, including but not limited to drinking water for private cabins and ranches, and also for generating electricity in some places on a very small scale. Many of the permits have since expired, leaving those who own the water diversions without any options for mechanically maintaining their water systems. In some cases, this lack of management threatens the environment, and the watersheds in which they exist. The Idaho Wilderness Water Facilities Act would give the Secretary of Agriculture the authority to reissue and issue special use authorizations to the owners of these diversion facilities within the Frank Church and the Selway wilderness areas for the continued maintenance of their water facilities. The permits only would be issued if the owner could prove that the facility existed prior to those lands being designated as wilderness. The facilities had been used to deliver water to the owner's lands since the designation, and the owner had a valid water right, and it would not be practical to move the facility outside of the wilderness area. Undoubtedly, in exercising the discretion, the Secretary would ensure that it would in no way denigrate these wilderness areas. There are several different individuals or businesses that have water diversions that in these wilderness areas that meet the description that I have given. Earlier this week, the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources held a hearing on H.R. 876. The United States Forest Service appeared at that hearing and testified in support of this bill. I look forward to working with Chairman Wyden and Ranking Member Murkowski to pass this bill quickly so as to allow for the maintenance of this water infrastructure. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I understand there's 1 hour available in opposition.
The Senator is correct.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to speak in opposition to the pending nomination. I wanted to take this few minutes today to discuss the nomination of Ms. Samantha Powers to be the next U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Now, let me begin by saying Ms. Powers is an impressive person. She has an inspiring personal story. She's clearly very intelligent, and she's already accomplished much in her career. However, I do have 3 concerns that I wanted to take a moment to highlight today. The first, I got to tell you, has to do with concerns that I have about her unwillingness to directly answer questions that I personally posed to her during her confirmation hearing in the Senate during our Foreign Relations Committee. At that hearing, I asked her about statements attributed to her in the past alleging that the United States had committed crimes, quote unquote, that it needed to reckon with. I raised this question not to embarrass her, but rather to give her the opportunity to clarify by either pointing out examples of these crimes or to clarify what she meant by those comments. But instead, she kept avoiding directly addressing my question. She kept saying that America was the greatest country in the world and that she wouldn't apologize for America. I don't think it's unreasonable to be concerned about those statements, and I do not think it is unfair to be concerned about the fact that we are sending someone to represent us at the most important international forum in the world who thinks the United States has committed crimes that it needs to reckon with. I believe that I and the members of the committee deserved an answer to this question, but instead what we got in response was a rehearsed line. And I got to say it was a missed opportunity for her and for all of us. And I want to say that for me, these statements that she made in the past and her inability to answer them or address them raise questions about her judgment. Although let me be clear, I certainly do not question her patriotism. But second, I have an even greater concern that she's being appointed by a president whose foreign policy is fast becoming an utter and absolute failure. From the crisis in the Middle East to strategic uncertainty in Asia to a country who we told was a partner but now is harboring a fugitive and a traitor who has done great damage to the U.S. national security, I believe the world is now more dangerous and more uncertain than when President Obama first took office. It's increasingly apparent that our foes are more willing than ever to challenge us. Even more troubling is that those who seek to emulate us, who desire the freedom that we all as Americans enjoy, are often left to fend for themselves with little American support. A strong, engaged America has been good for the world and for the American people. When America fails to lead, the result, as we see in Syria today, is chaos. A chaos that allows others with goals other than our own to fill the void we leave behind. History taught us twice in the last century that even if we put our head in the sand and try to ignore the world's problems, those problems will not ignore us. Now, I realize the American people are weary of war. We've paid a tremendous price in lives and money in the war on radical Islamic terrorism. But to follow the advice of those, including some in the Republican Party, who advocate disengagement from the world would be a terrible mistake. If we follow their advice, we will only pay a higher price in the long term. Now, let me be clear, that does not mean that America can solve every problem or get engaged in every civil war on the planet. I would confess we also have voices here that are too eager to engage America in every conflict on the planet. We need to be very careful about when, where, and how we engage American forces overseas. But isolationism on the one hand and hyper-intervention on the other are not our only two options. Between these two choices, we have a third option, and it is this: one based on the idea that while the United States cannot solve every problem in the world, there are very few problems in the world that cannot be solved without the United States. If a problem can be solved by using an international forum like the United Nations, that's fine. But more often than not, the UN can't and won't confront the problem. In the end, the truth is that America is still the only nation in the world able to form and lead coalitions to confront evil and solve problems. It is still the only nation on earth able to keep the seas open for trade. It is still the only nation capable of maintaining the safe balance of power in Asia and Europe and around the world. It is still the only nation on earth capable of preventing rogue nations from becoming nuclear powers. And it is still the only nation on earth capable of targeting and diminishing radical terrorist organizations who plot to attack and kill Americans here at home and around the world. We should be careful when we get involved. Foreign aid is not a one-way street and should always be conditioned and based on our national interests. Military power should be employed judiciously and only where it can make a difference in defending our long-term goals. But we cannot pretend that if we ignore our enemies, they will ignore us. We must be involved. And when we get involved, we must make sure not just that we're doing it the right way, we must make sure that we are doing it at the right time. Because sometimes acting too late is worse than not acting at all. And when we do get involved, it's okay to be motivated by humanitarian concerns. But the primary objective of our foreign policy must always be to protect our people from those who do or may one day want to harm us. This is the kind of clear strategic view of America's role and of our interests that should guide our foreign policy. It is the kind of clear strategic thinking that this President has failed to lay out. And as a result, what we see all around us is failure. The President dithered on Syria. We should have tried to identify secular rebels early in the conflict, and we should have made sure that they were the best armed and the best trained group on the ground. But instead, the President decided to lead from behind and allow others to decide who to arm. And the result is that today, it is rebel groups linked to al-Qaeda, foreign fighters, not even Syrians, who are the best armed and best equipped groups within Syria. And now I fear that Syria may be headed towards becoming like Afghanistan before 9/11, towards becoming the premier operational area in the world for global jihadists. The President entered office with the naive belief that we could convince Iran to become a responsible nation by, quite frankly, simply being nicer to them. He wasted valuable early years in his presidency not giving the Iranian threat priority. And now the Ayatollahs continue the march towards acquiring both nuclear weapons and long-range missiles that could one day threaten the United States. And I would be remiss if I did not point out that in 2009 he missed an opportunity to clearly stand on the side of those protesting a stolen election, and instead chose not to because he didn't want to interfere in the quote-unquote sovereignty of another nation. The President also wasted time thinking that the cause of radical Islamic terrorism was partially because George W. Bush was hated in the Muslim world. But despite his speech in Cairo, despite his efforts to close Guantanamo, despite his elimination of the use and the term war on terror, al-Qaeda continues to hate America. And even as I speak to you here today, they continue to plan attacks against America, here and around the world. The President's not alone in failing to confront these threats. I'm afraid that because of the success we've had in preventing another attack on the scale of 9/11, some of our leaders in both parties have been lulled into a sense of false security. I certainly support the privacy rights and expectations of all Americans. But my colleagues, I also know for a fact that the surveillance programs that our governments use have prevented attacks and saved American lives. Now, I think it's a mistake to dismiss privacy concerns as crazy After all, we have a government whose tax-collecting agency has targeted Americans because of their political views. But it's also a mistake to exaggerate them. After all, if a known terrorist is emailing or calling someone in the United States, we better be able to know who and where that person is. If Osama bin Laden had been calling someone in the United States on their cell phone, I promise you it wasn't his stockbroker. We better know, because these people are still plotting against us. And not if, but when they strike again, the American people are going to turn to us and ask us, what has the federal government been doing to prevent this? We better have a good answer. Because we live in a very dangerous world. One, by the way, where our enemies aren't just other countries anymore. Our enemies are rogue states and their well-armed militias and radical clerics. And this kind of danger calls for a clear strategic vision on foreign policy. And this president, sadly, does not have one. Which brings me to my third and primary concern about Ms. Power's nomination. And it's one that's related to the United Nations itself. We need an advocate in New York who makes it their primary focus to ensure that the United Nations is more accountable, that it is more effective, and that it serves U.S. interests, and that it is not just some multilateral ideal in which we invest all of our hopes. Now, if she's confirmed today, I hope that Ms. Power does indeed become that type of ambassador. But I have not been satisfied by the evidence thus far of this administration's willingness to be serious about tackling these issues over the last 4.5 years that ensure that every American dollar going to the UN actually advances America's interests. And I think that Congress needs to play a more active role in forcing this very much-needed change to occur. So what I'd like to do here in closing is spend a few minutes highlighting legislation that I recently introduced to this effect, and I'm pleased to have as co-sponsors Senator Cornyn, Senator Risch, Senator Flake, and I hope more of my colleagues will join this effort. I'm not the first person to raise concerns about the effectiveness and the utility of the United Nations. Former Senator John Danforth, who was serving as our ambassador to the UN in 2004, when the UN General Assembly couldn't even pass a resolution condemning human rights violence and violations in Sudan, said at the time, quote, "One wonders about the utility of the General Assembly on days like this. One wonders if there can't be a clear and direct statement. One wonders if there can't be a clear and direct statement on matters of basic principle. Why have this building? What is it all about?" Unquote. And anyone who has followed the UN closely, especially in recent years, as the Security Council has failed to respond to the crisis in Syria, as more than 100,000 Syrians have died and hundreds of thousands more have been forced out of their homes, across borders, straining all of Syria's neighbors, leaving behind a failing state that is about to become a safe haven for global jihadists. All of people who share these concerns and have seen this happen, they should be rightly asking the same question that Senator Danforth asked back then. In the midst of this horrific crisis, the UN has even been unable to achieve consensus on the issue of whether to allow international humanitarian organizations to provide cross-border support to tens of thousands of Syrians stuck in camps, facing frequent shelling and attacks from the Assad regime. And just as we're troubled by this inability to tackle the world's toughest problems, we should also be angry about the fact that for decades, more human rights criticism at the UN has been directed against Israel than against actual human rights violators and the UN agencies and organizations that have employed blatant anti-Semites. Or that for decades, recipients of UN foreign aid have only voted with the United States at the UN less than 1/3 of the time. And such support, by the way, doesn't even currently factor into U.S. decisions about who receives our foreign aid. Or the fact that the world's most notorious tyrants and human rights violators are allowed to serve on the Human Rights Commission or Human Rights Council rather than being condemned by it. Or by the fraud and the mismanagement that has pervaded the UN's peacekeeping operations, including abuses and exploitation of the very people that those peacekeepers were sent to protect. Or by the Security Council resolutions on Iran and North Korea that members of the UN willfully violate, as we recently saw with the Panamanian capture of a ship transferring weapons from Cuba, one rogue state, to North Korea, another one. Or by the proliferation of mandates that have clouded the organization's mission and its effectiveness. The list goes on and on. But let me be clear. I'm not here today to argue that we don't need the United Nations. Ideally, we would have a United Nations where the nations of the world would come together and seriously deal with North Korea and Iran and radical Islam and human rights. But the UN we have right now isn't capable of any of this. It's basically become a forum for nations whose interests are directly opposed to ours to block our efforts and use the United Nations as cover. That's how North Korea and Iran continue to evade sanctions. That's how Israel's enemies continue their efforts to delegitimize the Jewish state. That's how Assad continues to massacre his own people with weapons built in and supplied by the Russians. More than 6 decades after its creation, we still hope for a UN with resolve, a UN that acts with effectiveness and purpose. Sadly, the UN's persistent ethics and accountability problems are limiting its role. And until the organization addresses these important issues, it will continue to be ineffective and often irrelevant. Americans should care about this more than any other people, because we shoulder the primary fiscal burden of the UN's budget, and our patience is not limitless. We don't believe in continuing to throw money at programs and projects that fail to accomplish their objectives. So my hope with the legislation that I filed is to provide an incentive for the United Nations and the President and our ambassador in New York to modernize the international body along a spirit of transparency, respect for basic human freedoms, and effective nonproliferation. This legislation would also attempt to address the anti-Semitic attitudes that have become so prevalent in certain corners of the UN and seriously diminish the effectiveness and the credibility of the entire United Nations system. At the core of these reforms that I've proposed is an effort to instill a sense of transparency and competition at the UN by its adoption of a budgetary model that relies mostly on voluntary contributions. The legislation would also strengthen the international standing of human rights by reforming the UN Human Rights Council in a way that it would deny membership to nations under UN sanctions, designated by our Department of State as state sponsors of terrorism, or failing to take measures to combat and end the despicable practice of human trafficking. Other provisions of the bill seek meaningful reforms at the UN Relief and Work Agency that provides assistance to Palestinian refugees of the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict. This legislation is needed because the structure and bureaucratic culture of the organization often makes it impossible, or at best downright difficult, to achieve meaningful reforms. In closing, for more than 6 decades now, the United Nations has served as an important multilateral forum to address peace and security issues throughout the world. But it has never been, and it is not now, a substitute for strong American leadership. When America fails to lead, the world becomes more dangerous. The United Nations is badly broken, and I hope we will work to force meaningful transparency and accountability reform for the UN. But so far, this administration does not seem very interested in doing so. And unfortunately, at least based on our conversations, neither does the nominee before us. And therefore, until we begin to take some positive steps in that direction, I will not be able to support Obama administration nominees who have not committed to significant reform at the UN. Ms. Power has failed to make such a commitment, and therefore that is why I am voting today against her nomination to be our next ambassador to the United Nations. Mr. President, at this time, I'd like to yield back the balance of the time available to me.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I rise to speak on behalf of Samantha Power's nomination to be the ambassador to the United Nations. As I said in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing which I chaired on Ms. Power, her appointment to ambassador to the United Nations has come with much fanfare and with some criticism, which at the end of the day means she must be doing something right. And I think that in that regard, as I listened to my colleague a member of the committee, express his reservations and his opposition to Ms. Powers, I think we have to have some context here. When she responded, the United States is the greatest country in the world, and I will not apologize for it, it was her way of rejecting any characterization of statements that she made in the past. It was very clear to me. And I want a United Nations ambassador sitting in front of the world who considers the United States the greatest country in the world and who will not apologize for the United States before that world body. And she made it very clear that that's exactly what she intends to do. Now, on accountability, you cannot achieve accountability at the United Nations if you do not have a UN ambassador there to lead the effort and accountability. And on those questions where she was asked by several members, are you committed to making the United Nations a more accountable organization? Not only did she say yes several times in the affirmative, but she gave examples of how that accountability can be achieved. We need an ambassador to pursue accountability at the United Nations. And finally, I agree with my colleague that when America fails to lead in some critical times, we leave a void in the world. But we cannot lead if we do not have a United Nations ambassador raising their voice and their vote on our behalf on some of the critical issues of the day. And so this nomination is critical to pursuing the national interests and security of the United States. And I think whatever my colleagues might think about her nomination, I don't believe anyone can question her considerable credentials or her years of service. Certainly no one can question her willingness to speak her mind, especially her willingness to speak out on human rights issues around the world. As a war correspondent in Bosnia, in the former Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in Sudan, she has, as she said in her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, seen evil at its worst. Ms. Power has built a career and a reputation as one of the nation's most principled voices against all human rights violations and crimes against humanity. And I know that voice will be heard around the world should we confirm her. While some of us may not agree with everything she has written and said during her extensive career as a journalist and foreign policy professional, she has been a tireless defender of human rights, and she has seen the tragedy of human suffering from the front lines firsthand, and it has given her a unique perspective. In her role at the National Security Council, she was clearly involved with U.S. policy towards the United Nations. She knows the UN's strengths, its weaknesses, and how it operates. At the end of the day, the United States needs a representative at the UN who will uphold American values, promote human rights, secure our interests and the interests of our national security. I have every confidence in Samantha Power's abilities to do exactly that, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting her nomination. Personally, I am incredibly appreciative of the principled position she has taken on the Armenian genocide. Her belief that we should use the lessons of what clearly was an atrocity of historic proportions to prevent future crimes against humanity is a view consistent with my own, and which is supported by her role on the President's Atrocities Prevention Board. And I agree that we must acknowledge the past, study how and why atrocities happen if we are ever to give true meaning to the phrase, never again. As the son of immigrants from Cuba, I personally appreciate her commitment to exposing Cuba's total disregard for human and civil rights. And I respect her for not idealizing the harsh realities of communism in Cuba. I know from the conversation we had in our office that she appreciates the suffering of the Cuban people, the torture, the abuse, the detention, and abridgment of the civil and human rights of those who voiced their dissent under the Castro regime. And I welcome her commitment to reach out to Rosa Maria Paya, daughter of longtime dissident and Cuban activist Oswaldo Paya, who died under mysterious circumstances last year in Cuba as his car was bumped off the road. And I look forward to her fulfillment of that commitment. So, Mr. President, at the end of the day, it's fitting that someone with Ms. Power's background represent American interests and American values at the United Nations. In the words of the UN preamble, it was created, quote, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in equal rights of men and women of nations large and small. Who better than Samantha Power, a recognized advocate for the fundamental rights of every human being, to be our ambassador to the United Nations? If confirmed, her focus will, of course, be on the crisis du jour: the Middle East, Syria, Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and others, and the nature of nations that emerged from the Arab Spring. But I know that while she is meeting those challenges, she'll also be engaged on human rights around the world, on freedom of expression in Latin America, on fighting HIV, AIDS, malaria, and polio in Africa, on the status of talks to resolve the 66-year-long question of Cyprus, on women's rights in Pakistan and labor rights in Bangladesh and human rights in Sri Lanka. And finally, let me say that Ms. Power, during her nomination process, has repeatedly expressed steadfast support for the State of Israel during her hearing, in her testimony, and individually to several members of the committee, including myself as chair. She has promised to stand up for Israel at the United Nations, and I know she will. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that a letter to the committee in support of Ms. Power from 6 bipartisan former ambassadors to the United Nations be included in the record.
Without objection.
Calling on the Senate to confirm her as soon as possible in this time of opportunity to have a U.S. representative in New York advocating for American interests. I urge my colleagues to support this qualified, experienced nominee. I know she will serve the nation well. And with that, Mr. President, I'll yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also rise to support the nomination of Samantha Power to be our ambassador at the United Nations. Within the last month, I had a unique opportunity as the junior member of the committee that my friend Chairman Menendez chairs, Foreign Relations, to go to spend a day at the United Nations and learn about it from then Ambassador Rice. I left that day with a couple of reactions. First, very proud to be an American, and second, concerned about the challenges that the institution faces. First, on the proud to be American, I think it's important for us to realize, for whatever its flaws, the United Nations would not even be in existence if it weren't for this country. It is a quintessential American idea to pull together an institution that tries to build peace, that tries to solve hunger, that tries to solve global health needs. The idea really first gained force through the efforts of American President and Virginian Woodrow Wilson, who won the Nobel Prize for trying to get the League of Nations going at the close of World War I. That league lasted for 20 years and collapsed for many reasons, including the United States' lack of participation in the global effort. But the idea didn't die. The American idea stayed alive, and in 1939, the State Department, within 2 years after the collapse of the League, started to work on the next version. FDR worked on it during his entire presidency and was scheduled to have the first conference to organize the United Nations 2 weeks after his untimely death in 1945. The second decision made by President Truman in 1945, the first was to keep FDR's cabinet, was he was posed with this: after FDR's death, we can postpone the meeting in San Francisco about the formation of the United Nations. But Truman said, no, we're going to go ahead because this is something that the world needs and America is uniquely position to lead. And ever since it started, in funding, in support through good times and bad, and the very controversies that Senator Rubio described earlier in the floor, this United Nations has worked hard to do good, has worked hard to achieve an ideal that may be impossible ever to perfectly achieve. It is a tribute to the U.S.'s view of our role as a global leader that the United Nations exists today. But I was also struck, again, by many of the challenges of a tough globe, the challenges of UN problems in the ethics and finance area, and the challenges that confuse many Americans as we look at the UN, principally those referred to by my colleague Senator Mendez, a history of anti-Semitism at the UN that confuses us as we watch it. And so what are we to do with this institution that we birthed more than any other nation, that still offers great hope and service every day and yet needs significant change? Well, I think what we should do is put a strong person in to be the United States ambassador. And Samantha Power is that individual. She has the strength to tackle the challenges that need tackling at the UN. She's had the career, as described by earlier speakers, as a war correspondent, a writer, somebody who has snuck across borders to take photos of atrocities in Darfur and then bring them to the attention of the world. Her writings and her activism have inspired generations of activists around the world to take up the cause of human rights. She's been the President's senior advisor on matters in the United Nations in the last 4 years. And just to focus on this issue, here's what Samantha Power has done in that role to help deal with this issue of anti-Semitism in the UN and a double standard in the treatment of Israel. She worked to ensure the closest possible cooperation between the U.S. and Israel at the UN, champion efforts to stand up against attempts to delegitimize Israel. She was key to the U.S.'s decision to boycott the deeply flawed Durban II conference in 2009, which became just an event to criticize Israel. She helped mobilize efforts for the UN sanctions against Iran. She's challenged unfair treatment of Israel by UN bodies, including the one-sided Goldstone report and the efforts to single out Israel in the Security Council following the Turkish flotilla incident. And she's opposed unilateral moves in the UN that could undermine prospects for a negotiated peace agreement between Palestine and Israel, and how hopeful we are at the developments this week, and we pray that they'll go forward and find positive possibility. This is the activity that she's had in the UN, helping in the UN, while she was not the UN ambassador. I want her in that seat so she can carry forward on those initiatives and others. She's championed efforts to protect persecuted Christians and other religious minorities in the Middle East and beyond. She's helped spearhead the creation of new tools for genocide prevention, and she's led the administration's efforts to combat human trafficking, all values that we can be proud if they would be on display at the United Nations. I said during her hearing that the one thing that made me scratch my head a bit about her when I heard that she was nominated is I think of her primarily as a very blunt and outspoken person. And blunt and outspoken is not always the best job description of a diplomat. But in the case of the United Nations, with the challenges there, the challenges needed in financial reform, the challenges needed to push back against some history of anti-Semitism, the challenges of ethics and other issues, we need blunt and outspoken at the United Nations. We don't need vague and amorphous. We need the kind of strong leadership that Samantha Power would provide. I think of many United Nations ambassadors. It's been an A-list of people, from Henry Cabot Lodge to President George H.W. Bush before he was president, to Bill Richardson, to Andrew Young. We could think of many, but the two I think of most when I think of Samantha Power, I guess I think of because they're Irish-American. Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Jeane Kirkpatrick, strong United Nations ambassadors who stood proudly for the values of this country, who gave no quarter, who were good diplomats but didn't hesitate to call the truth whenever they saw it. I think Samantha Power will do exactly the same thing, and that's why I urge my colleagues to support her nomination. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield the floor back.
Mr. President.
The Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I appreciate my distinguished colleague from Virginia's remarks. He's a very thoughtful member of the committee, and I appreciate his remarks on behalf of Ms. Powers. With that, I yield back all remaining time, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Without objection. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Aye.
Ms. Ayotte. Well, thank you. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckidge. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, perfect song, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Fitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Burr, Chiesa, Coburn, Cornyn, Donnelly, Kane, Klobuchar, McCaskill, Menendez, and Wicker. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Rubio voted in the negative. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye.
Draft two adjournment resolutions that would, one that would adjourn until that pro forma, and then another one that would adjourn through the end of the recess. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye.
Hi, Caroline. This is Greg Sampson calling. I'm actually up at the parliamentarian's desk.
Mr. Sanders, aye.
Senator Moran that designates the Junction City Community-Based Outpatient Clinic. I had a question about that. So I'm looking at our precedents.
Lee.
And it looks
Mr.
like
Lee, no.
I don't know if that's accurate. A VA clinic, but okay.
Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, aye.
But I noticed that it's being dedicated to, being designated under the name of this Lieutenant General. And the ones that we have in the past that we've referred to VA have been specifically said it's a VA clinic. And it's not a problem. I just wanted to.
Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson,
I
Aye.
don't know what you're thinking. Thinking. Or if you have any thoughts on that at all. Okay.
Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray? Aye.
Let's see. No, oh, is that the number up here? Yeah, that should be right. Yeah, I'm sitting up on the floor, so. No, it's Greg. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Mr. Franken? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Mr. Rono? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Nelson? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mr. Tester? Aye. Ms. Collins? Aye.
Yes.
Mrs. Boxer? Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Cruz?
Okay.
Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Warner?
Okay.
Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Cochran? Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye.
Good job.
Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye.
Generally, it seems like the naming of PA clinics have gone to PA.
Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye.
All right, thanks.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye.
Have a good August.
Thanks. I have to
Ask him for his lunch. Have a good. Tell Annie I said hey.
Thank you. Have a great trip to Otis.
Yeah, we will. Thanks.
Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Johann, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Beckidge, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Flake, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye.
Every day, it's not this guy comes pretty close and he does this.
Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Pryor, aye.
Alright, main thing is that bills.
Mr. Leahy, aye. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye.
They'll do it in a respectful way.
Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye.
Mr. Rockefeller? Aye. Look at it.
Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye.
Mrs. Feinstein.
Aye.
Mr. Chambliss, aye.
Aye.